华为现在可以说是在舆论的风头浪尖。在25日的巴塞罗那 MWC 世界通讯大会上，华为带着新产品折叠手机 Mate X 亮相。这款手机据称已经搭载了华为的 5G 终端晶片，下载速率极高，安全防范升级。目前它的售价是2299欧元，大概2600美金，预计会在年中上市。同时在会上，全球第二大通讯电信公司沃达丰Vodafone建议使用华为产品，还称如果欧洲禁止使用华为，可能会导致 5G 网络在欧洲发展延迟2年。但也不乏反方的声音。爱立信和诺基亚称，欧洲通信建设落后有自己的原因，跟华为关系不大。26日，华为轮值董事长郭平还在会上表示，华为没有做任何坏事，没有后门，也没有证据支持美国对华为做出的间谍控诉。尽管美国近来不断加大力度游说欧洲各国禁用华为 5G 设备，一些国家，比方说德国的观望态度，还让华为在欧洲的未来不那么确定。华为官方近日公布将在维也纳开旗舰店，势头完全没有因为在舆论的风头浪尖而消减。而不管是什么立场，华为 5G 建设在欧洲能否继续推行，都是一件未明朗的事。作为一个普通的通讯产品消费者，要怎么理解欧洲政府对华为所代表的中国科技和 5G 建设的焦虑？上周与我们连线的前澳大利亚国防部官员、现驻伦敦独立研究员John 在本期关于华为与欧洲关系的讨论中和我们继续分析。在我们的讨论中，他提到，人们对 5G 越发焦虑，主要是对华为所代表的中国科技三大巨头百度、阿里巴巴和腾讯的应用越发强大所带来的焦虑。中国科技巨头们技术崛起和应用多样，形成了自己主宰的一套网络应用空间，在与美国主导的空间隔阂开来。但是我们在讨论这个问题时候要分清楚，张力提到不要把这两个问题混淆，因为 5G 技术的发展跟讨论中国的网络空间的发展是不一样的。他还提到，从科技角度看，欧洲各国对华为感情复杂。在欧洲，欧盟作为一个整体，可能会对华为的做法比较谨慎，因为欧盟要考虑到外国科技的投资和中国科技带来的潜在风险。不过，欧盟的独立成员国就不一样了，他们比较不愿意放弃中国这个巨大的利润市场，也不愿意为了安全风险推迟 5G 高科技的建设可能。拿德国来说，它是全球一个领先的工业技术国家，掌握 5G 非常重要。从德国最近的表现看，德国政府为此也权衡了国家经济发展和保障安全的轻重，看起来似乎优先了经济的发展。他还提到，就安全风险而言，目前毕竟还没有任何证据出现说华为是中国政府的间谍。美国司法部的控诉上， FBI 部长暗示的更多是中国对美国在不同领域上带来的潜在风险，当然不仅仅指的是华为，还有之前中国学生尝试窃取敏感信息被 FBI 抓起来的那一件新闻。所以欧洲各国要去做决定的时候，不仅是要考虑华为的安全风险，还要考虑如果接受华为会给和美国的关系带来怎么样的影响。以下请听我跟 John 的讨论。
Thank you for sharing those articles beforehand. That's a really interesting piece, and something that I might actually want to start our conversation with. So, it has a really interesting opinion piece from the former Google CEO Eric Schmidt, which he brought that up last September, I think, in 2018. Which is about how the internet is going to be split in two, with one being led by China, the other one by the US. I think this piece is interesting because it relates to what we're going to talk about today, which is Huawei and how it's influencing the internet worldwide. So could you tell us what does that mean? What does it mean that the internet is going to be split in two, and if you agree with what he said?
Well, that certainly depends on what you mean by split. the internet at the moment is not split, it's globally unified in the sense that there is data controls on information moving into China, but the internet in China at the network and the transport layers runs on the same protocols as it does anywhere else in the world, meaning that it is basically interoperable with the networks in other countries. I think what Eric Schmidt was referring to was the evolution of a distinct applications ecosystem in China. So the Chinese internet, in the sense of the applications that have been built by Alibaba, Tencent, Baidu, and all of the associated companies, as we all know, is quite distinct from that which has been developed in Silicon Valley. And in many ways, Chinese internet users use basically a separate universe of applications that don't interact with the applications which Americans and residents of many other countries around the world do. But we have to understand that this isn't a split internet. A truly bifurcated internet would be one that is not interoperable or even physically disconnected. So that, of course, is a theoretical possibility, but I think that a lot more would need to happen before either China, the United States, or any of the world's 180-odd other countries would see that as a worthwhile proposition.
And do you see when he was referring to a split internet, he was kind of referring to the rise of China tech, especially probably 5G development?
Well, of course, 5G is slightly separate as a concept. That refers to fifth-generation mobile networking technology. Now, of course, because that is simply another means of transferring data, that is one means of connecting more devices to the internet. And the concerns around 5G have revolved basically around the firstly, additional capacities that it may create for malicious activity over the internet because of the greater volume of data that will be being transferred and the greater number of devices that will be able to be connected. And secondly, the greater amount of activity that will be organized through the internet because of those new capabilities. So 5G and its particular association with Huawei is the focus of a generalized concern, I would say, about Chinese technology that has been building for a large number of reasons, one of which is the rapid development of the Chinese internet technology sector and its expansion overseas. But we need to be quite careful in conflating developments across different industrial fields and in different contexts, which is often lost in the discourse that you see around Huawei, particularly over the last few months.
Right. Looking like more European countries are being dragged into this conversation at the moment. We have first Poland, Czech Republic, now Germany, as you've mentioned just now. And I wonder, could you analyze to us, from probably a technology cooperation perspective, what has been the European Union's relationship with China tech?
Well, we need to distinguish here between the European Union and the individual member states. I would say that there's a lot of concern at the level of EU bodies. There's an attempt underway at the moment to develop a common EU position on, for example, review of foreign investment into the EU, where a lot of concern has been generated over the takeovers by Chinese companies of European firms in sensitive sectors such as semiconductor manufacturing or advanced robotics. On the other hand, the individual EU member states are often reluctant to, firstly, damage their lucrative economic relationships with Beijing, and secondly, to disadvantage themselves potentially in the move to this new internet-enabled economy that 5G is supposed to facilitate. So again, in the case of Germany, as one of the world's leading manufacturing powers, a quick transition to 5G and establishing German firms in the new implementations that will be made possible by the Internet of Things and the greater connectivity that 5G will provide is a matter of economic security, which obviously the German government has to balance against the potential risks of including Huawei equipment in the network. And here, it has to be noted again that no evidence has actually been produced of Huawei equipment being used to enable malicious activity by the Chinese state. There have been reports, for example, of the African Union headquarters, which was wired by Huawei, having transmitted the infrastructure in that building, having transmitted information suspiciously back to addresses in China. But there again, it's not a clear-cut case. So when European governments have to make decisions about their long-term economic future and their relationship with Beijing in the context of a difficult relationship with the United States under the Trump administration, obviously they have to weigh these competing considerations.
I want to go back a bit to the Huawei case, the Department of Justice charges against Huawei. The FBI director has briefly mentioned that there were potentials for spying on behalf of the government. However, they have not been able to give any solid evidence on that. So I wonder if you can tell us why there isn't any proof yet and why they are still trying to bring up this Espionage Act.
Well, I can't say that I have any particular insight into U.S. intelligence assessments other than what's been published regarding Huawei and what it may or may not have done. As you said, in the public domain, there is no definitive evidence that Huawei has ever facilitated espionage on behalf of the Chinese government. There's certainly a lot of indications that Huawei has engaged in questionable business practices, and some of those are the basis of the case against Meng Wanzhou. But we again have to contextualize this. The FBI director has made a great many statements about the threat that China poses to the United States across a range of fields of social and economic activity. He's described China, I believe, as the greatest, he hasn't used the term existential threat, but certainly as a whole of society threat to the United States. And that, of course, is not concerned just with Huawei and 5G, but also with things such as espionage conducted by Chinese students in the United States, and a wide range of activities which have shifted the attitude in official Washington and among the US business community against China over the past few years. So there is a broader context here in which the skepticism about Huawei's potential role in its relationship with the Chinese government is taking place. Well, it's going to be an interesting few months. As I mentioned, 5G technology is now at the point where many countries are beginning trials and rollouts with a view to bringing layers of services progressively online over the next few years. Initially, that will mean faster download speeds for consumers, but over the 2 to 5 year time frame, we're likely to see the next layers of the 5G service rolled out, which will enable the more complex industrial applications which I referred to before. So obviously, this is a critical period, which presumably is why so much political pressure is now being brought to bear by the United States on its allies and third parties not to include Huawei equipment, because the decisions that are made about telecommunications infrastructure over the next year or two are going to have long-term implications. Once the network infrastructure begins to be constructed and the contracts have been awarded, it is going to be difficult to reverse course, and we're already seeing that in the case of Huawei equipment in existing telco infrastructure, where, as I mentioned, a lot of providers already have a great sunk cost, if you like, in Huawei equipment, particularly since a lot of the existing equipment is going to provide the foundation for the initial stages of the 5G rollout. So the opportunity cost from using Huawei equipment over the past 10 years is really large. And if Huawei is accepted as an equipment provider for 5G networks going forwards, that is going to be very difficult to reverse in future if the security and risk assessment changes, never mind about the financial cost.